Welcome everyone. If you've just joined us, again, an invitation to come on up to the front of the room here. Join us right at the front. Forget the reserved signs. Take your deserved seat. My name is Dr. Wally Seward. I have had the honor of being on the organizing committee for this Equity Summit since its original in 2019. When Erica Henderson invited me to the table, she has been a big force behind this as well. She couldn't be here this weekend, so I wanted to make sure that her and Jessica Payne's name got mentioned as well. There are two folks that worked a lot on this. Yeah, absolutely. Worked a lot on this event and weren't able to be here today. But it is my distinct pleasure to bring to you this session on the Reparations Commission happening in the city of St. Louis. I have three of the commissioners with me here this morning. The way we're going to do this session is the following. I'm going to introduce the three of them. Then we're going to have a short presentation on the commission itself, where it comes from, what its mandate is, what the hopes are. We'll do a Q&A session after that. And then we've got a couple of presentations on the background, kind of what information are they taking into these considerations about reparations and the history of St. Louis. And then we'll have another Q&A session at the end. Welcome everyone's response. I know the committee is really interested in hearing from the public, so please look forward to those Q&A sessions. Bring your questions. To do my introductions, beginning right here immediately to my left, Delisha George is Program Manager for the Deaconess Foundation, where she is creating, woohoo, yeah, that's right, absolutely. Where she's creating capacity building programming and funding for community-based organizations working toward justice, and now also a commissioner and secretary of the Reparations Commission. Immediately to her left, Dr. Will Ross, who is the Associate Dean for Diversity, Principal Officer for Community Partnerships, and Endowed Professor of Medicine and Nephrology. Okay, now you can clap. And now Reparations Commissioner and Vice Chair of the Commission. Sitting to his left, Dr. David Cunningham, Professor and Chair of Sociology at Washington University, St. Louis, who most recently also edited a special journal issue on the legacies of racial violence in the U.S., and now a Reparations Commissioner. So thank you all very much for being here. So let's give them a round of applause. They've got a lot of work to do. They've already been doing a lot of work, a lot more ahead of them. But I'm going to step aside for Ms. Delisha George to start in on the commission.
Thank you, Wally, and good morning to everyone. I hope you all can hear me. I know the room is pretty big. Okay. I'm not as tall as Wally. So welcome. We are three members of the Reparations Commission, and we are happy to share with you today where we are in our work. In 2021, a coalition of 25 community organizations advocated for the establishment of a Reparations Commission within the city of St. Louis. As a founding member of Mayors Organized for Reparations and Equity, or MORE, St. Louis Mayor Tashara Jones openly supported reparations and rectifying racial injustices in our city to allow for the creation of a more equitable St. Louis. On December 7th, 2022, Mayor Tashara Jones established the City of St. Louis Reparations Commission by signing Executive Order 75. Oh, clicking. Sorry, I forgot to click. Did it go? I don't see it though.
If we can ask to have the slides up on the main screens, please.
There we go.
That's it.
Okay. So where is it? It's not there.
What are we looking for?
Executive Order 75. There we go. Okay. Executive Order 75 was signed by Mayor Tashara Jones on December 7th, and that established the City of St. Louis Reparations Commission. All of the commissioners are City of St. Louis residents. We explore and recommend opportunities for reparations within the city as well. And we'll present those recommendations to the mayor and the Board of Aldermen at the end of our commission, which is March of 2024. In part, Executive Order 75 reads, establishing a community-driven commission to assess the history of slavery, segregation, and other race-based harms in the city of St. Louis, explore the present-day manifestations of that history, and ultimately recommend a proposal to begin repairing the harms that have been inflicted. By definition, from the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, reparations is defined as a process of repairing, healing, and restoring a people injured because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental human rights by governments, corporations, institutions, and families. I moved back to St. Louis in 2012 from Washington, D.C., and my plan at the time was to stay here for 1 year. God laughs at our plans. So I'm happy to still be in St. Louis, but I also understand that St. Louis is one of the most segregated and racially inequitable cities in the U.S. We have a lot of work to do. There are systems in place today that contribute to the events in St. Louis's history that continue to impact lives, and those systems include education and housing. The Delmar Divide is a real thing. We know about the history of Mill Creek, as well as Pruitt-Igoe, which happened, that demolition was between 1972 and 1976. So we're not even talking 100 years ago. And the Delmar Divide continues to affect our property values. I also live north of Delmar, so I'm completely in agreement with how that does affect those of us here. The Reparations Commission consists of 9 members, all of us from various backgrounds. We meet twice a month. Once we meet virtually for planning purposes, and the second meeting of the month is where we have a public forum, and we welcome public comment, and those comments help to form some of our themes for our research. Our first meeting was held in April of 2023 at Harris Stowe State University. Our 8th meeting is next Wednesday at Deaconess Foundation at 6 p.m., and you are all welcome to join. The Reparation Commission established a timeline at our first meeting, and in establishing that timeline, we acknowledged 3 phases. The first phase, which happened between April and July, we took that time to listen to those who attended the meetings. And again, we formed certain themes around those listening sessions, as we called them. We also had presentations from experts, local and national. And some of the topics that were covered were the wealth gaps in St. Louis, health inequities and health disparities, and racial violence as well. Phase 2, which we are currently in the midst of, is where we will identify the themes that are based on those comments as well as our own research. And the themes that we have identified up to this point include housing, community and economic development, education, criminal justice, and labor. In phase 3, which will wrap up our commission work, we are scheduled to wrap our commission work in March, but again, that could depend on where we are and what we find, but we intend to release a draft report of our recommendations, and that draft will be shared with the public. We will take feedback on what that draft contains, and then we will compile the final report, which we will present to the mayor and the Board of Aldermen. And also, I think it's important to note that that report that we intend to prepare will contain a lot of data, but it will also contain personal narratives. And we know that those personal narratives are just as impactful as numbers. And so we want to make sure that the stories of those who have been directly impacted by these inequities in St. Louis are heard. And with that, I will wrap my portion of our presentation and turn it back over to Wally.
All right. Thank you, Delisha. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to the audience for questions on to where we are at the moment, who the commission is, what they're doing, what they're ready to do, what their goals are. And I want to put this in context for just a second. As someone who studies the nature of justice, when we think about justice, we think about remedial justice, which means if you're doing harm, stop, right? Restorative justice, which means place those folks you've harmed back into the position they would have been before you harmed them. And then punitive justice, right? Hey, you did something wrong, here's the consequences. Well, we haven't yet gotten to remedial justice, right? Now we're starting to think about restorative justice, but that's not even necessarily the final step. No one's yet talked about punitive justice in this context, but we'll leave that aside. At least maybe we can get to restorative justice. So if you have a question for the commissioners on the status of the commission to this point, I would ask you to please raise your hand and stand up and share that question with us. I see a question in the back. Thank you. Go ahead and share your name, and if you can, shout your question. I missed. Okay. So you caught the question. Your hearing's better than mine. All right, great.
So the question was around if the commission has considered what punitive justice could look like. We have not gotten to the stage where we would recommend a funding source or amount, and so but it is a consideration. There are a few things that we're considering as far as what that could look like, but we're not there to release that yet as we're still in phase 2 of our work. Do you want to add to that?
All right. Any other questions on the formation of the commission, who they are, what their goals are, before we move forward?
Wally, can I just add one more point?
Yeah, please.
And you also asked if it's a commission before a commission or something around that, and it's not. The intent is not to have this be a group that wants to form another group. We do intend to deliver a report and recommendation that should move forward the conversation with the City of St. Louis, understanding that we are the City of St. Louis's Reparations Commission. We're not the State Reparations Commission, and also the federal government attempt to rectify as well are separate, but we hope to influence as well. Okay. So the intent and the purpose for our work is not to have this be a report that's another report to add to a stack of reports. Understanding how that could be the feeling, right? But again, we are doing this work to land on a solution and not just to say this is what you should do. The hope is that it's implemented as well. And that from what we have been, what we have received from the mayor's administration, that is the intent, to find a solution of some sort. But also, again, I have to stress, we're the City of St. Louis Reparations Commission. So whatever happens with our commission, as with other commissions across the country, influences, right, the greater conversation, which is also valuable.
Local government as the working horse of democracy. We do it small, and we hope it gets bigger. I do see another question right over here.
My name is Liz Lewis. I was just curious if other cities are also have reparation commissions, what cities, and if they've shared their information, or if you could talk on that. Thank you.
Sure. So there are, I have my cheat sheet because I knew that that would be a question. But we've all heard of Evanston. And so Evanston is the first city to successfully implement a reparations program. And that program is in the form of housing. So they have a housing assistance program where they've given $25,000 to 16 residents within Evanston. And so for that program, of course, that sets a precedence which goes back to Wally's point of local government, because that then was, I would say, an inspiration for other cities to say, okay, maybe we can make this happen. So St. Louis has our Reparations Commission. Kansas City has also established their Reparations Commission. Chicago's exploring a Reparations Commission. Amherst, Massachusetts, Detroit, Michigan, Providence, Rhode Island, St. Paul, Minnesota, Asheville, North Carolina, and Berkeley, California are other cities that are exploring or moving forward with a reparations commission or task force. California is the only state that has a reparations commission, and Illinois has a reparations commission as well. But theirs is a little different with the format of it, so theirs is still a work in progress.
That's a great question about these other cities. Again, you have to recognize that our charge is local. Yet, in order to really affect change, really to have true justice over the past, of course, addressing the past hundreds of years, that is a national effort. And local municipalities do not have the resources to really address a problem of this scope. However, they can become advocates. They can address the consequences of injustice within their own municipalities and hopefully spur this national movement. Of course, we're aware that there is a discussion in D.C. about an actual reparations bill that unfortunately has languished a bit. So we can't wait for the national government. I think it's imperative that local districts, municipalities do what they can, again, recognizing that we're all under financial constraints. It doesn't mean that we can't act with the resources that we have.
And just quickly to add to that, I think we're at really an important moment as we're speaking, as DeLucia is saying, that Evanston is a bit out ahead in the sense that they've already made and begun to implement a particular set of recommendations. There are these set of ongoing processes, but this is growing as a conversation of a network of these local kinds of efforts, and it's really important that St. Louis is in that mix in terms of the conversation at this particular point. We're already at a point where we'll be building connections with Kansas City and other places, and the idea, as Dr. Ross is saying, is not that we're pooling resources and creating an integrated initiative, but that we're learning from each other and we're trying to build momentum that ideally can lead to this sort of national conversation.
Great, good question. I've got another question right up front here.
Maria Yaksich, and I'm curious, once you have this completed and you are stating that you are looking for solutions and you present it to the mayor, who else has to approve action on it once you present it? Because we're talking about a time frame of elections. I mean, and if there's a change on these leaders, what happens?
So the question just for the audience is, once they make their recommendations to the mayor, who else is in that pipeline in terms of possibly getting recommendations into the policy space? Who else needs to approve it? Is that all okay? Okay.
Sure.
And what happens if there's a leadership change? Great.
Certainly, our charge, there has to be some continuity of leadership, of course. Our charge is from the mayor, from Mayor to Charge Jones. And she is speaking on behalf of the Board of Aldermen. So when we complete our report, that will be presented to both the mayor and the Board of Aldermen. And jointly, they would issue a statement of support, endorsement, and obviously action going forward. If there could certainly be any type of change within the aldermanic caucus, within the mayor, but we still have 14 aldermen. They're not going to turn over at once. So there should be some continuity within the legislative session here in St. Louis.
For questions, I'll run the mic.
Perfect. Thank you, Joe.
Yep.
And we have one more question right here. And we have a mic coming. Perfect.
Thank you. My name is Ann Litwin. I just wanted to know what the date was, again, of the next public meeting at the Deaconess Foundation. I just didn't catch it, and I appreciate it.
It is November 15th, next Wednesday at 6 p.m.
Great. Thank you for that. Yep, we got another one. All right.
Hi, my name is Becky Patel, and I'm on the Board of Aldermen in the City of Clayton. And my impression from the mayor and the president of the board of the City of St. Louis is that we might be in a somewhat unique position right now in the city, in that finances are not our biggest constraint. Like, the city has, I believe, some access to financial resources at this point, and is working on, the best way to utilize those. And so I'm curious if that's also your understanding, and then if I'm right about that, and then also what, if any, scoping have you been given beyond what's in the executive order that you shared, in terms of like who, what, how big, how much, like things like that? Is there any type of scoping that's been suggested to you?
Thanks for the question. Thanks for the microphone also in the audience. Yes, we all are aware of the resources that have become available through the RAM settlement and ARPA funds. So yes, there's a significant amount of funding there, but nothing has been allocated because we are still in the process. We're still in a formative process of gathering the data. We're now, as you can see from the time frame, entering the period for actual analysis before we submit the report. And so we just want to make sure that we have all the input from you and other members of the community before we can actually write a report stating what sources would we draw from and how would they be spent. We have to wait. Now, okay, just remind me of the latter part of your question.
Scoping. If you'd gotten any scope.
Like thinking specifically about like who might be targeted to benefit from reparations, or what types of forms it might take. We've heard about the example of what happened in Evanston, but I don't know if there are other examples or what that looks like.
Sure. Well, again, we're still in the relative infancy of this, and we've heard comments from the audience stating that they prefer direct cash payments to those who who are actually have a legacy, showing a descendancy from those who were enslaved. There are those who advocate much more of a systemic approach, really addressing all those upstream issues such as housing and education, neighborhood revitalization. So, the answers have been broad, appropriately broad, and so it's up to us, the commission, to really purse through those and prioritize, and then present a set of recommendations. But it's premature. We're going to be entering that process in the next quarter.
And one tangible piece of progress that we have made based on input from the community, based on consultation and focus on what other communities are doing, and Dr. Ross just mentioned half of these, but we are convening working groups around 6 main areas that have really come to the fore as key. And so Dr. Ross mentioned housing, economic revitalization, we're focusing on health, we're focusing on jobs and the economy, we're focusing on police and the criminal legal system, and I'm not sure if I said education. If not, that would be the 6th one.
Great, thank you. And just as a little bit of a side note, if you want to follow this, I'm assuming if the report comes out in March 2024 and anything heads toward actual appropriation, we'd probably be looking after the summer break in the Board of Aldermen, so kind of fall 2024. And I would have to go through the budget, I'm assuming, right? So it'd be an appropriation, so it'd be the Board of Aldermen as well as the Board of Estimate and Apportionment. We have a strange budgeting process here in St. Louis, although that may change. We have a charter commission too, so lots of stuff going on. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and move us forward. If you have questions, thank you. We're gonna hold those to make sure we get to all of our content. And I'm going to go ahead and invite Dr. Will Ross to come up and take us into the next section of our presentations.
Thanks for the questions. That input is actually taken into account. It really represents what we've heard from our prior sessions across the region. So we really are hearing there's some consistency in what the people want to hear and what the people want to receive. So I'm here to talk about the health of St. Louis. And the presentation is somewhat dire because the health status, particularly of those vulnerable members of the community, particularly African Americans, is dire. And it's unfortunate that here in 2023, we still can determine the health of an individual based on where they live, based on their zip code. That should not be the case. That's invariably the case here in St. Louis, across the country. You've heard, you're a very sophisticated audience, you've heard the disparities in life expectancy, that 18-year gap based on living in near North St. Louis compared to Clayton. That gap is persistent, it's intractable, and it's really consigning so many people to short lives where they do not reach their full health potential, and is unconscionable, unacceptable. We found out over many years that this is not necessarily due to what I do as a physician in a hospital delivering care, but it's largely dependent on these social and structural determinants of health, the things that you just heard from Professor Cunningham, the areas that we'll be focusing on. So health is really more related to those social and structural determinants. That means as a commission, if we're really sincere about healing, and so this whole commission is about healing, then we have to address those upstream measures. Let me have my first, I can do this here. So back in the mid-90s, the last public hospital in St. Louis closed, St. Louis Regional Medical Center. I was the medical director of that hospital. And when it closed, I really began to worry about the health, even more so the health of those who were attending, who were receiving care at that hospital. And I just worried that they would not find a trusted place and that their health would further deteriorate. So afterwards, I worked with a group of individuals, civic leaders, to create the St. Louis Regional Health Commission. And our goal was to really create a network, a safety net network for St. Louis so that we can maintain the health of the individuals who were historically receiving care. This is one of our first products from that commission. And we just simply wanted to know where were people living and what conditions were they living in. And this is the first map. It's a geocoded map looking at zip codes with high rates of poverty. So we're assessing the poverty percentage of patients living below poverty throughout the region. And you can see fairly clearly that given the fact that the zip codes with the highest poverty were coded red, you can see where they are. There's a consolidation of zip codes in North St. Louis and North County, and there's a segment going in South City. I want to pay attention to these two populations of poverty because that poverty in South City, that crescent shape going south, really are mostly first-generation individuals, are new Americans, immigrants and refugees. They represent first generational poverty, and as they become acclimated to American life, they will move on. That poverty in the north of Del Mar, that hard red, is intergenerational poverty. Some individuals will leave when they have the resources. Most will not have the resources to leave, and that poverty will continue. And here's the part that we found when we were constructing these maps. We can take any healthcare indicator and superimpose this on this map, and it would have the same distribution. We can superimpose infant mortality, and we see the levels are there in that North City. We can look at maternal mortality, asthma deaths, cancer deaths. We can look at COVID deaths. We can look at homicides, and we have the same distribution. And so people's lives, their health are really conditioned on where they live. Now, next slide. Oh, I have it here. I keep forgetting. We furthermore noted that this disparity based on zip codes is striking and predictable, and it's important that we can acknowledge resources that have to be targeted toward these areas. Now, let me give you some data, and it's again, it's really dire, the data. In 2021, 19.5% of black people living in St. Louis were living below the poverty level. That's compared to 8.2% of white people. The legacy of segregation continues in St. Louis neighborhoods to this day, with this results in high concentrations of poverty. The persistent gap in the rate of poverty in the past 30 years means that poverty affects 1 in 3 African Americans in St. Louis, but less than 1 in 10 whites in St. Louis City. The impact of poverty on children is especially troubling, since starting life in poverty has negative consequences for health well into adulthood. About half of the children in St. Louis are living in poverty. That's 46%. That's quite striking compared to less than 10% white individuals. We continue to outpace large segments of the country in terms of infant mortality, where children live in St. Louis have infant mortality death rates of 13.5 deaths per 1,000 live born. That's compared to maybe 3 or 4 deaths per 1,000 live born for whites, 3 or 4 times that rate. This is unsustainable. This is unconscionable. Now, one of the things that we found out was that we were an attraction to a lot of people, not because of the good things we were doing, but because of this remarkable, devastating poverty in St. Louis. In 1995, the British Broadcasting Company came to St. Louis to really chronicle the depth of the despair and the segregation here in St. Louis. And they produced this report, the Del Mar Divide. We all in this room know about that. I don't need to talk about that. But here's one graph that you should all commit to your mind. I think it's the most compelling graph, showing that divide and showing what is the makeup of individuals who live north of Del Mar compared to those who live south of Del Mar. And it's quite striking in terms of educational attainment, housing value, overall income. We know that this is not an issue that developed in 1995 or even 1990s. We have to, if we're sincere about really addressing social justice, have to understand the root cause of all of this. And the root cause, you're going to hear a little bit more about that. We're going to have time to talk about that. I'm going to conclude in a couple of minutes. But that root cause goes all the way back to the Civil War. We won't talk about that. But there's something that's really is unique to St. Louis, and that is what happened in 1917. And many of us know about the East St. Louis race massacre. I don't call it a riot, I call it a massacre, in 1917. But prior to that, the St. Louis leaders had already enacted a series of harsh restrictive covenants, really preventing whites from selling, leasing, or renting land to African Americans. And African Americans were relegated to living in certain areas, and those areas, as you can surmise, were north of Delmar Boulevard. That residency continued unabated. You know a lot about what happened with displacements through the Mill Creek Valley and Pruitt-Igoe, and we're going to talk about that. But that really stabilized, unfortunately, and the health deteriorated, unfortunately. Now, I hope many of you have seen this graph before. This is really showing the life expectancy by zip codes. So this, you just heard from Dr. Maddie from the health department, and so before she came, we actually produced this data, and Jason Purnell at the Brown School of Social Work took the data and consolidated it in a report called the For Sake of All, and this is one of the graphics that was used in that report. I hope you can see this in the back. Again, it's fairly telling, it's fairly gripping about how zip code determines the health of an individual. Next slide, okay. Our health was deteriorating because we didn't have the focus on these social and structural determinants. We didn't have the focus on neighborhood stabilization. That all changed in 1937 when the Harmon G. Phillips Hospital was created. I think many of you know. I'm just curious. Hands of anyone who knows about the Harmon G. Phillips Hospital. So a significant number. It has tremendous bearing on this subject because the hospital didn't just deliver care, but it really had an economic multiplier effect in enhancing the resources available to the Ville community, the Ville neighborhood, and it made the Ville a healthier place to live. That hospital closed in 1979, and the Ville neighborhood is yet to recover. The health of those individuals is yet to recover. So these efforts to really chronicle the history of St. Louis and really document how that relates to the health of St. Louis are absolutely critical. Those who don't learn from the past are certainly doomed to repeat it. And our goal is to really remind us of this history. Because as a physician, as a public health leader, I cannot begin to address health care and the health of individuals unless I know this history. So let me just wrap up and say that what's been remarkably consistent over all these years, all these decades, all these centuries, is their unrelenting, gripping reports of how poverty and racism continue to affect the St. Louis region and impede progress in achieving health equity. We have to realize that the main determinants of health would be poverty, of course, and income inequality. Until we address those two, then we will continue to have this persistence of poor health in our region. So these disparities will remain intractable until a coordinated effort is undertaken to address these social determinants of health among African Americans in St. Louis. And these unconscionable disparities obligate systemic reform, such as what we're presenting, to repair the harm done to African American communities. And this has to be done through sustained and targeted reparations. Rebuilding our neighborhoods and schools and eliminating intergenerational poverty would be the best way of going forward to improving the health of St. Louis. Many of us are old enough to know a lot of our history and the history of post-war Europe when the Marshall Plan was enacted, and they proposed and was delivered what would be in today's dollars $146 billion to rebuild post-war Europe. We're asking that you think about a Marshall Plan, that we think about a Marshall Plan for St. Louis, and that we actually think about the extent of the resources we need to rebuild our communities, rebuild our health. It's a major effort, but if we choose not to go this way, then we'll be here next year, 10 years later, having the same discussions. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to be following Dr. Ross's presentation to try to give a bit of a feel for what we've been doing in our public meetings. So Dr. Ross is speaking really powerfully about disparities in public health as that relates to residential segregation, as that relates to income inequality. And what I'm hoping to do today is to focus on the range of areas that I mentioned earlier that the Commission is working on. But in so doing, what I'm hoping to do is echo themes that have been introduced across our public meetings in presentations from another of our commissioners, Gwen Moore, from the historian Walter Johnson, from the sociologist at WashU, Dr. Jeff Ward, and myself. And when I do this and present these kinds of aspects, I'm going to draw on the core idea in Dr. Walter Johnson's book. I think a lot of you in this room probably know The Broken Heart of America, which came out a couple of years ago. And Walter Johnson in that book really describes St. Louis's history as defined by violence. And when he says violence, he means that action that benefits those who've held power in the city for decades and disproportionately targeting St. Louis's black population. And so, to be clear, when I'm talking about violence today, I'm not speaking necessarily and primarily of things like crime in neighborhoods and things like that, but really violence as political action, really a means to maintain barriers and divisions that favor the lines of power that we've seen operating in the city for decades. And certainly, when we think about violence, these can take on structural forms. So Dr. Ross is already mentioning Mill Creek Valley and the restrictive covenants that limited where people can live and move and build wealth. And so Commissioner Moore, in one of our meetings, spoke very powerfully about Mill Creek Valley. We see here that the plan to raise Mill Creek Valley, to literally eliminate the neighborhood, was rooted in the city's 1947 comprehensive plan. So this is one of the maps that came out of that. It was clearly overseen by white officials in the city, including the mayor at the time, Raymond Tucker, in the 1950s. So we see here, and clearly, colloquially, what we would hear is the idea of black removal by white approval. And Mill Creek Valley is, of course, a very resonant and powerful and damning indictment of that particular kind of process. We also can think of violence as taking, of course, physical forms, and we've already heard from Dr. Ross referencing the 1917 East St. Louis race massacre. We can think about, in the city of St. Louis, about mobs attacking black residents seeking to swim in a newly integrated pool at Fairgrounds Park in 1949. And of course, the long and sustained history of fatal police violence in the city. And I just want to briefly cite research by a collaborator of mine, Dr. Ashley Jackson, who's in the Brown School of Social Work here. And Dr. Jackson, one of the things that she's done really importantly is gone through the ACLU archives. And for decades, the ACLU has tried to document, compile, and represent victims of police violence in and around St. Louis. And one of the things that Dr. Jackson shows here, and I'll just quickly, there's a lot going on in these maps, but based on the ACLU records, she was able to compile a comprehensive sense of police shootings over time, and she's overlaying them here on a map that looks at the composition of neighborhoods. And so the darker areas in this map of the city of St. Louis are areas that have higher proportions and concentrations of black residents. And one of the things Dr. Jackson's finding that's very important here is that what we see, of course, on the left, we're looking from the 60s to the 80s, and on the right, we're looking over our last 2 decades, beginning in 2000. 2000. And what we're seeing, of course, is that the black population is moving, it's migrating, and so we see a lot of patterns along those lines. But what we also see is that police violence is in effect migrating and following those shifts in population. And so we see as the black population moves and migrates, we see police violence basically following that along. And so we see this as a systemic form, something that's reproducing over time the same kinds of patterns and are tying into many of the other policy and other measures that we've been hearing about today. And one thing I want to underscore that's very clear in social science research on the legacies of these kinds of actions that's very important is that when we talk about things like the 1917 race massacre in East St. Louis, we can go back further in the city of St. Louis to the 1836 lynching of Francis McIntosh here in downtown St. Louis. If we think about these acts of violence that have occurred far in the past, one of the things that we know is in places that are beset by that violence, continue to exhibit higher levels of inequality. I've listed a bunch of particular studies that have focused on political polarization, have focused on rates of contemporary residential segregation, black-white income inequality, black victim homicide rates, the prevalence of corporal punishment in schools, all of these as measures of violence and inequality. Today, what we find is that communities that are beset by violence historically continue to exhibit higher rates of inequality today. And the importance of that really is that left unaddressed, past violence itself continues to exert power in terms of reproducing the inequalities that we're facing today. That's a pretty bleak set of research findings here. We know that we're addressing so many things that are very contemporary and ongoing, and then to stack on that and saying that we have this legacy of historical violence that itself is continuing to exert this power is important. But the other side of this research that's also important is that we find that areas that seek to address their histories in meaningful ways. And this is about recognizing those particular histories and seeking to incorporate them into the dialogue that informs contemporary policy, informs contemporary priorities. In those kinds of communities that have robust education efforts that seek to incorporate recognition into local politics, what we also see is that those communities actually have lower rates systematically of these contemporary inequalities. So this power of the weight of history in terms of the legacy of past violence and action on contemporary inequalities, that legacy effect can be broken, in effect, by trying to create a politics of recognition and action based on that recognition. And so that's part of what we're here for today through this reparations process, is to consider how we can do that in a way that's robust and powerful and meaningful. And that's especially important in an overall political climate that we're faced with today, where we obviously see much resistance and backlash in many places across the country around recognizing these histories, around teaching histories that involve violence, even teaching Black history in general in any way that is deemed as critical in terms of interrogating these past kinds of actions. And one thing I will say is that alongside our commission effort, we are unattached to this effort I'll talk about now, but I think it's like-minded in a restorative justice way, is that the Equal Justice Initiative, which many of you may know, they're based in Montgomery, Alabama. They're headed by the lawyer and legal scholar Brian Stevenson. One of the things that the EJI is doing is spearheading a national project around these community remembrance acts. And this is really about recognizing the long history of racialized violence in communities and memorializing victims of those communities in order to build a meaningful dialogue today. And so one of the things that I'll say, there are 800 counties across the US where there were documented acts of what Brian Stevenson refers to as racial terror lynchings. And all of those 800 counties are being invited by the EJI to participate in a process where they acknowledge this history and seek to incorporate it into present discussions around how to move forward more equitably. And this process involves several steps. It begins with soil collection on the ground where a fatal action like this would have occurred. And so we see, I don't know how well you can see it, the middle photo here has jars of soil that were taken in the city of St. Louis here. And I will say that both St. Louis City and St. Louis County have community remembrance projects in process. I'm saying this in part to underscore the difference here and to think about the importance of being in a community that is willing to have the will to address these kinds of histories and think about what it means to inform our present dialogue. Because in the city of St. Louis, similar to what we see around the convening of this Reparations Commission, our mayor, Tashara Jones, has been actively supportive of this remembrance process. It's the photo's too small to the left here. You see the old courthouse and the arch there. That is the soil collection ceremony, and actually Mayor Jones is speaking in that photo as part of the ceremony, so there's this active participation of local government in supporting this sort of process. The St. Louis County process was in the municipality of Valley Park, and in Valley Park there was also the soil collection. The next stage in this process is to place a historical marker. In St. Louis, in the city, that process is underway. It's supported by the city. There's a site at the corner of Keener Plaza where this historical marker will be placed within the next year. In Valley Park, however, there has been a strong denial of that history and a refusal to date to allow this historical marker to be placed within its borders. City officials there are claiming that there isn't documented evidence that the lynching actually occurred within their borders at the time, and therefore the marker should not be placed within its borders. I spoke of this during our community meeting here, and there was some media there, and so some of you may have seen subsequently, the Post-Dispatch did a long front page feature story on the Valley Park process and how it's stalled in this way due to this resistance. St. Louis on the Air at our local NPR station has done a segment with Dr. Jeff Ward as well, speaking about that. And I say this today to really underscore this distinction, because if we think about the forms of justice that Wally mentioned at the outset here, one of the things that we're thinking about very squarely today around reparations is the politics of redistribution, right? Of thinking about material resources that have been denied to particular segments of the community and thinking about how resources can be redistributed to address those sorts of legacies and ongoing policies. So to be clear, redistribution is at the center of our conversations here. But alongside that, we can also think about a politics of recognition, about thinking about an acknowledgement of these histories and an incorporation of that dialogue into our current day discussion and policies, including in spaces like this. And so one of the things that we know, to go back to that line of research I talked about earlier, is that in spaces that are doing this in a robust and meaningful way, that is one mechanism to try to break that chain of connections where the weight of history itself is exerting power in terms of maintaining inequalities. And so we want to attack those inequalities with resources and redistribution today, but also a politics of respect and recognition that creates a landscape within which we are using the weight of those histories as a way to move forward and reduce the sorts of inequalities that are being reproduced through these processes. So, thank you.
All right. Thank you all for really, really interesting presentations. I have so many questions. A couple of quick things. You know, Dr. Ross, I've heard so many times now the social determinants of health. I think we need to start calling them the social determinants of well-being, or just the social determinants of human thriving. They're just those basic things that humans need, right? And they're a beautiful measurement. And I'm hoping that that concept breaks its way out of the public health space into broader conversations. David, I love the fact that you brought up the R word, redistribution. We appreciate that. An important piece of the puzzle. I would like to ask one question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. Hearing these presentations really gives an idea of how hard a job you all have on the Reparations Commission. So I'm just curious whether you see reparations more as a response to past harms and past generations in history, or more as a response to the current continued harms. And how do you or can you separate those things? And how do you use those as a basis for thinking about reparations? I hope that question makes sense. I just think that there's just so much that some of those basic divisions of what it is we're actually addressing, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well,
If you grab your microphone there. Great.
great question. Past is prologue. And so the past that we've cited, the past that goes far beyond the 19th century, 18th century, affects the health, affects the position in society that African Americans have because of this concentration of wealth, this persistent income inequality that's been cited from individuals like Richard Wilkinson and Bill Darity, particularly of Bill Darity in the past 5 years, stating that income inequality is the root cause of poor health and the root cause of the unfortunate contraction of income in the African American community. And that happened because of concentrated poverties, concentrated problems. Going back to the Homestead Act, which provided hundreds of acres to whites. This is, I think, 1846 or so. And they were able to leverage that land into actual income, wealth, which they then passed through their children. Just you had this legacy of wealth. It follows by, it's followed up with the GI Bill. I mean, a government program which allocated substantial funding for GIs returning from the war, for housing, and for education. But African Americans were denied that federal resource. And we can keep going forward. So all of these acts actually perpetuated the wealth concentration, the income inequality, which leads us to the conditions that we're seeing here. And so these social and structural determinants of health are, again, dependent on a concentrated, intentional effort to segment society based on whiteness, based on social status. And many of us think that that's past, but all of us are, black and white, are living that legacy. And we all have to own up to that legacy, that this was, the conditions that we're seeing are the consequences of those acts that disenfranchised African Americans for so many decades and so many centuries.
Thanks. I so appreciate Dr. Russ mentioning income and wealth as sort of infused through what he was just saying. And that distinction is really important as it speaks to this question because, you know, if we're thinking in a contemporary period and we're thinking about the present, I mean, income inequality is of course, tremendously important. And we can see inequalities in terms of access to employment and what that means and translates to in terms of income. But when we think about wealth, that is something that very much speaks to inequality today as produced intergenerationally across the decades. And you know, when people look at levels of inequality as reflected in income, they're significant. But when you look at levels of inequality as reflected in wealth, it is absolutely dwarfed for the reasons that you might imagine. Denying people the ability to own homes in particular places where values of that property are going to raise exponentially over time denies people the ability to pass down that wealth intergenerationally. And so when we see 2, 3, 4 generations later, all of that wealth base that people with full access historically have had access to, we do not see for other segments of the population. And when we see this as a racialized process, as of course we do, you know, that wealth framework speaks very directly to that interconnection between past and present. And Dr. Ross also mentioned William Darity, the economist, who, you know, speaks maybe most strongly along these lines. And for Darity, Dr. Darity, what he'll say is that the standard for reparations processes should be whatever it takes to reduce the racial wealth gap to zero. Dr. Darity is also very clear that if we take that seriously, that has to be a national project. There is no way that any local municipality has a level of resources and a scope that would enable that to happen. And so he sort of uses that standard as a way to say that there needs to be national will behind this sort of project, but it also underscores the centrality of wealth as the past kind of bears upon the present.
Wally, I would also add that to the point of well-being, that is another reason why we do open it up for public comments, because the data's great, and of course we can't argue with that. Systems have been in place for generations, and so what happened with my grandparents' generation affects me the same way that what happens with me will affect my daughter. And we have to take into consideration the fact that part of reparations and in repairing is restoring and healing. And so when you talk about well-being, yeah, you know, diminishing the wealth gap is extremely important, but also making sure that people are okay. You know, that has to be a part of it too. And so acknowledging that there is a need for a reparations commission, that there's a need for a reparations panel in these cities to say, we know we did wrong and we need to figure out how, I believe is also a very important step to take, because acknowledging that pain first and foremost, that for some of us is like, okay, of course we want to see solutions, but we also want to know that you absolutely are taking into consideration we are 400 years behind because people didn't want us to succeed, plain and simple. So I think that well-being piece is very important.
Thank you for that, and thank you for pushing back on the premise of my question. We can't separate the past from the present in a lot of ways. The one thing that I would say about the difference between the past and the present is while all of the outcomes that we have now can be traced back to the past, because they're here now, unlike the harms in the past, we can actually do something about them. That's the big difference. If we think about, if we think about justice, I like analogies, right? I like stories. That's my personal theory of change for individuals, is stories. So if we think about, we take the analogy of the black experience in America as an individual who's getting the crap beat out of him for the first 100, 150, 200 plus years of the country, right? Remedial justice is, hey, let's stop kicking. But if that's all we do, then it's, oh, I stopped beating you up, we're good now. No. We have to move on to restorative justice, and even if we weren't the ones that did the kicking, if we walk past while they're bleeding out, that's our responsibility. So I want to pause there with my comments and go ahead and open it up to the audience for questions for the commissioners. I see we have one right in the back there. Thank you, Zhao.
Thank you all for all of the work that you're doing and for the information that you shared with us today. My name is Erin McMullen. 10 years ago, I was an AmeriCorps Vista at SLU, and I used those health disparity maps that you produced to look at the disparities of access to healthy food in communities. And as I'm sitting here, it's hitting me that those maps, that data, it's old. And we've known these things for over a decade. And I'm happy to see that we have a reparations commission, but what do we need to do in order to actually change something? And then a follow-up question, are there recent, is part of the reparations commission to collect recent data that reflects what is going on now? You know, we have these maps that are 20 years old, 10 years old. You know, how are we moving this forward?
This work. Thanks for that question. And so the maps are old, but the problems are not. The problems are not old. The problems are contemporary. I agree with what you were saying. There are some things that we can address now, but we have to put those into context. And so, just to show you why those maps are relevant, many of you may know about Ness Sandoval, who's a brilliant epidemiologist, expert in geospatial mapping at St. Louis University, who's presented a series of maps showing a very sobering data that St. Louis is rapidly depopulating, even more so than we once thought. The census of St. Louis is down to 286,000. And for the first time, we're seeing a nosedive in the number of African Americans in the city. African Americans are leaving the city for obvious reasons, of seeking opportunity. And as they leave, you have a group of individuals who don't have those resources, who are going to be further burdened by the lack of structural support, and their health, their conditions will further deteriorate. So we again, all of this is based on all those restrictive covenants that isolated African Americans, followed by redlining in the 70s. All those things conspired to really concentrate poverty in these areas, and that led to these untoward events, these outcomes we're looking at. So we have to acknowledge that past, and the way to resolve this, I want to get back to what I said earlier. We need a Marshall Plan with Marshall Plan level funding to address to reduce food insecurity by creating a network of well-stocked grocery stores that are affordable. We need to create a network of schools that are providing teachers with appropriate salaries to do the work that they need to do to create the workforce that we need. We need to create banking institutions that actually believe in social banking and making commitments based on the needs of the community. We need to invest heavily in neighborhood revitalization, not gentrification, but going in and providing affordable mixed income housing. And we can't just provide that. We have to remember that Professor Cunningham showed a map about police violence and gun violence, and we know about the homicides. If we really want to address the issue of violence, we have to realize that a colleague of mine in Los Angeles told me this story about creating a bakery for gang members in South Central LA, and as a consequence, the gang violence just precipitously declined. He said, well, here's why that happened. Nothing stops a bullet like a job. People need jobs. And so we can't just do small businesses. We need to really focus on really relocating Fortune 500 companies back to St. Louis. Those are the things that we need to do. Those are large structural things which will address all those upstream needs of people, those the Maslow hierarchy of needs we have to address. And so it has to be systemic, but we have to recognize that the full expenditure is extensive. It's what Bill Garrity wrote about. So that's the way to address this, by probing the past and asking what are the solutions. And the solutions have to be systemic in order to eradicate poverty and actually maintain or reduce the level of income inequality that Professor Cunningham spoke of.
All right, we have another question here, but before I get to it, 1 second. I'm Jalian Yang, Director of Storytelling and Communications at Ford through Ferguson, and I wanted to quickly just share a resource with you all that responds to Aaron's question. So if you're really interested in data and research about inequities, racial inequities, and you don't know about the Equity Indicators Dashboard, you should look it up. But speaking to what Aaron was talking about, that data is also several years old. And so I bring up the Equity Indicators Dashboard because it is a tool that Ford through Ferguson has worked on in collaboration. And also, it is one of the things that is really hard to fund. We know that racial equity and racial justice work is really hard to fund. So one of the tangible things that you can do is support Ford through Ferguson's work. We are one of the co-organizers of the Racial Equity Summit. It's one of the examples of things that have come up since the Ferguson Commission. But also, if you personally cannot contribute money, advocating for racial equity work, since you're here is really important, so.
Hello. Ooh, my God, I'm so sorry. Wow, I forgot how I speak. Okay. Hi, my name is Shannon Dickerson, and I have a couple of questions. My first question is, are you equally weighting, you talked about being a St. Louis reparations, focused on St. Louis, of course. Are you equally weighting federal policies and the hyper-local stuff that's happened, like the displacement of Mill Creek and all these places? Like, are you thinking about the balance of all of those things and weighting them in any way? And then, as you talk about like systemic responses, are you thinking about ways that the systemic responses are not just programmatic, but are policy-based? When you show this map of the police violence following Black folks, like, are you thinking on the level of like, maybe the budgets for police shouldn't be as they are? Like, are the recommendations gonna go that broadly and foundationally, or is it just gonna be plopping programs that follow Black folks around?
Thank you for those questions. I just want to insert, we are at time, so this is going to have to be the last question, and ask you all to attempt to address that as quick as you can. The difficult questions. Thank you, Shannon.
I'll say quickly, I really appreciate that question. I think that gets at the heart of the work that's ongoing for us right now. And I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves and say this is how we're pinpointing this balance, because this is really at the heart of our working groups at this point. I will say that, just quickly, that a disparities-based approach ideally accounts for the sort of balance you're describing. Like, if we can really tackle the, at least recognize, measure, and kind of tackle the degree of disparity today, which incorporates the weight of history, as we've been saying, that also will encompass the range of historical policies and practices that have kind of led to that disparity. So that is one way to think about that balance. I think programmatic recommendations, like you're describing around policing and other institutions, are clearly within our purview to recommend. I mean, what we're doing is making recommendations, and while we haven't drafted those yet, I think the kind of policy and programmatic type of things that you're describing are clearly part of that conversation and an important part.
Yeah, I have a real quick answer. The state that we're in are due to policies that were enacted by the federal, state, and local government. And so our response for remediation has to be to call out those policies and reverse those policies and create systemic changes in how we do things here in St. Louis, how we function in St. Louis. And so, yes, we have to start looking at larger macro policies if we really are to affect the change that we want in this region.
Shannon, I would also add that without systemic change, really nothing happens, right? So for Evanston, they created the housing program, which was in response to discriminatory housing practices. But you have to go back to Dr. Cunningham and Dr. Ross's point of affecting the system and changing the system that created that policy. So I don't think we can do one or the other. I believe our work influences both. But again, understanding that as the St. Louis Commission, hopefully we will influence a Missouri commission, right? But we know outside of St. Louis, you start to get into Missouri, and that's a different situation. But we also have to keep in mind that the more that you see commissions pop up across the country, the federal government has to pay attention. And we also elect the people who get there. So that's a whole other panel, but I will just say that the goal, I feel as a commissioner on this particular commission, my goal is to see systems transformed.
Great. Yeah, that's all right. All right, and with that, unfortunately, we have to wrap it up, but I want to give a quick shout out. Zhao, thank you for seeing a need and filling it, and shout out to Forward Through Ferguson. Shannon, thank you, and Invest STL for being the fiscal sponsors for the summit. We really appreciate it. Huge thank you to our panelists for today. One more big round of applause for our commissioners. Woo! And if you go to the Equity Indicators dashboard, look at the children's asthma statistics. They're horrific. That's the worst one. All right, thank you all. Head out to your next session. Appreciate you being here today.